Good evening. Your Excellency, Ambassador Wahidullah Waissi, Deputy Vice Chancellor Global, Professor Colin Grant, Dr. George Varghese, Dr. Rhonda Atui, Leanne Smith, Zainab Kavari, Thamara Thomas, and Zohal Hashimi, who could not make it this evening, and our authors, of course, Emeritus Professor Bill Maley, Ahmad, Shuja, Jamal, and Fred Smith, all of our other great and good members of the academic nomenclature in your various degrees, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Whitlam Institute, the Centre for Western Sydney, the Humanitarian and Development Research Initiative, and the University of New South Wales Institute for Global Development, it is my distinct honour and pleasure to welcome each of you to this special event, the launch of 2 books, The Decline and Fall of Republican Afghanistan and The Sparrows of Kabul. My name is Professor John Jurians. I am the director of the Whitlam Institute. The Whitlam Institute is guided by Gough Whitlam's 3 great aims: to promote equality, to involve the people of Australia in the decision-making processes of our land, and to liberate the talents and uplift the horizons of the Australian people. The Whitlam Institute strives to deliver distinctive, bold, and inspiring policy, research, and programs that promote common ground, inclusive national identity, and civic engagement for all Australians. We focus upon issues of concern across the political spectrum and seek to deliver a nation-building agenda that will, as Gough charged us, help the great and continuing work of building a more equal, open, tolerant, and independent Australia. In keeping with this ambition for our nation, the Whitlam Institute strongly supports Indigenous peoples having meaningful input into decisions that affect their lives and their futures. We believe the Uluru Statement from the Heart is a genuine gift to all Australians. It is an invitation to walk alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for a better future for our nation. The Whitlam Institute believes the voice to Parliament aligns with the Whitlam government's guiding principles of equality, democratic participation, and reconciliation with First Nations peoples. Also, in keeping with this ambition towards justice and opportunity, we meet this evening for the launch of these 2 books on this, the 2nd anniversary of the fall of Kabul. When the Taliban took control of Kabul in August of 2021, the quick collapse of the former government caught many by surprise. Afghanistan is now facing one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. The Afghan economy has no cash to pay salaries or buy food. Western aid has been suspended because the Taliban government includes designated terrorists. And millions of Afghans face acute mainstream malnutrition and starvation in the coming months. The Taliban lack capacity to manage these monumental challenges, but there is no clear alternative to their rule. The Afghan economy seems caught in a low-level equilibrium that leaves most Afghans poor, hungry, and in need of humanitarian assistance. Moreover, new headwinds threaten to precipitate further economic decline, risking a repeat of the economic freefall in the initial months following the August 2021 Taliban takeover. Just before we commence proceedings in earnest, a few housekeeping matters. We would ask you to ensure your phones are turned to silent, and also note that we are recording this evening and that there is a photographer present. If that is a matter of concern, please come and see me at the end of this evening. Also, if you wish to use the bathrooms during the proceedings, please head to this door here, and the bathrooms are immediately behind me here. I would now like to introduce Dr. Rhonda Atui, Director of the Centre for Western Sydney, within the Office of Pro-Vice Chancellor Strategy, Government and Alliance, to welcome you on behalf of Western Sydney University and to offer an acknowledgement of country. The Centre for Western Sydney is the university's leading authority on its region. It delivers high-quality research and advocacy for and with the communities of Western Sydney. I welcome Rhonda to the podium.
Thank you, John. Just beginning with respect for Aboriginal cultural protocol and out of recognition that our campuses occupy their traditional lands, I would like to acknowledge the Barramadagal people of the Darug Nation on whose land we meet and their elders past and present, and acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who might be here with us tonight. May we continue to cherish and protect this land, learn from its rich history and heritage as we work together to shape an inclusive and prosperous Western Sydney. I am proud on behalf of the Vice-Chancellor of Western Sydney University, Professor Barney Glover, to welcome you to Western Sydney University on this most important anniversary, marking 2 years since the fall of Kabul. In doing so, I'd like to extend a very special welcome and one of strong respect to His Excellency Wahidullah Waissi as Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. We recognise, Your Excellency, that you have served as Ambassador since 2017 and that you are persisting in fulfilling your diplomatic duties operating outside of the realm of Taliban influence. Many of us, particularly those who have lived the majority of their lives in Australia, can at best only imagine the complexities that supporting the people of Afghanistan, who you serve, has involved over the last few years. And we warmly welcome and acknowledge your presence and look forward to hearing your reflections later on this evening. This event is a collaboration between colleagues at Western Sydney University and UNSW Sydney, which brings together perspectives on a complex and critical issue that has touched and will continue to shape the lives of not only the people of Afghanistan and its diaspora, but also the world. This is an important discussion to facilitate as we grapple with the ongoing impacts of the war in Afghanistan since 2001 and the subsequent withdrawal of US and foreign troops 20 years later in August 2021. The experience of Afghanistan is an important one which was shaped by a range of complex factors which contributed to its current crisis. And tonight we look forward to the opportunity to learn, to reflect, and to consider some of the perspectives gleaned from those who had a close eye on the machinations of how domestic and international politics collided in Afghanistan. We bring together the authors of 2 key works that provide the first book-length accounts and analysis of the fall of Kabul in 2021. Hearing from these authors and our esteemed speakers, our event will critically examine the political decisions leading to this collapse and explore a more deeply personal account of an Australian diplomat on the tragic events that unfolded. And in doing so, building our understanding around the broader historical and the emotional implications of the fall of Afghanistan. Now, before we do proceed with this important discussion and hear from our speakers, I'd like to also mention and warmly acknowledge Associate Professor Nicole Georgiou, who is the Director of Western Sydney University's Humanitarian and Development Research Initiative, otherwise known as HADRI. Nicole has worked as an aid practitioner in Japan and in Vietnam with UNICEF and various civil society organisations. And her academic work explores similar terrain, with a focus on Australia's engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. Unfortunately, Nicole couldn't join us tonight, but is celebrating with her family at her son's graduation. Now, this event did come together as a collaboration with HADRI, the Centre for Western Sydney, and the Whitlam Institute, from colleagues from the Institute for Global Development at UNSW Sydney, and specifically George Varghese, who we have here in our presence tonight. Thank you, George. Like many of those you'll hear from tonight, Dr. Varghese has himself experienced living in Afghanistan, having previously held a number of UN posts in Afghanistan, including Chief of Service Sustainable Development at the UN Assistance Mission. On behalf of Western Sydney University, I would like to specifically acknowledge George's expert and considered guidance in the development of tonight's program, and thank you for your collaboration with us. And in that spirit of collaboration and partnership, I'd like to now introduce Professor Colin Grant, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Global at UNSW Sydney. Professor Grant, I'm sure we'll have a much longer bio, but I'm going to keep it short, was previously Vice Principal International at Queen Mary University of London and has worked in South America, China, India, Malaysia and Pakistan, among other locations. So, Professor Colin Grant, may I ask you to please come and address the audience tonight? Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by departing from script and acknowledging the eloquence with which John and Rhonda have just spoken about the Uluru Statement and the acknowledgements so heartfelt in your opening words. So thank you very much for that. One can only endorse those sentiments very strongly. Khamaham Asr Bekhair, Your Excellency, Vice-Chancellor, most distinguished speakers, guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start by expressing my absolute delight at being asked to speak briefly at this special event. It is hosted, as you know, by the Whitlam Institute in partnership with the Humanitarian Development Research Initiative at Western Sydney University, my first visit this evening, first of many, and the UNSW Institute for Global Development. Takes place under the auspices of the UNSW WSU alliance established in October 2020. This partnership provides a platform for both universities to leverage their combined expertise and resources in order to extend their reach and maximise their social and economic impact for the Western Sydney region. This initiative, the partnership, and indeed tonight's programme speak very directly to our shared commitment to placing world-class research and education at the service of the greater good, global and local. This evening's diverse programme has as its particular focus support for conversations that cast a light on the emerging contexts and pressing needs of many communities in Afghanistan. It also serves to promote, again in partnership, that's vital, conversations that highlight the complexity of international responses to conflicts and brings clarity to challenges at the nexus of security, development, resilience building and humanitarian engagement. On a personal note, I'd like to share that as a former trustee of the Council for At-Risk Academics, CARA, in London, established in 1933 when terrible darkness swept across Europe, I feel personally connected with tonight's programme, perhaps in an unexpected way, but also in its intellectual and creative courage. CARA, the Council for At-Risk Academics, supported not only 40 Afghan academic fellows across UK universities, but also 90 family members. I can still picture in one of my last duties in London, one Afghan mother cradling a baby safely born in London, while chatting to her young son about his love of Arsenal Football Club. It was a deeply humbling experience, and I salute their and your commitment and courage. The Whitlam Institute, the Humanitarian Development Research Initiative at Western Sydney University, and UNSW's Institute for Global Development are hosting the joint launch of these two books, The Decline and Fall of Republic in Afghanistan by Emeritus Professor William Maley and Ahmad Shuja Jamal, and The Sparrows of Kabul by Australian diplomat and artist Fred Smith. And these two books provide the first book-length accounts of the analysis of the fall of Kabul, and both are important works that help us interpret Afghanistan's recent, deeply troubled history. We'll also hear from a WSU law student, human rights activist and former Afghanistan police officer Zainab Khavari, and Tamara Thomas. Zahal Hashmi is not with us this evening, is that correct? Yeah. And the inspiring work, I long to hear more about the Her Village Foundation. So I very much look forward to the rest of this evening's programme and to learning, genuinely learning more about this wonderful commitment to working together for the greater global and local good. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Vice-Chancellor. It's now my distinct pleasure to invite Zainab Khavari, a law student at Western Sydney University and a human rights activist, to say a few words. Zainab was a police officer in Afghanistan and due to her activities fled the country for her safety in 2013. She's a dreamer, a fighter, and an achiever. She believes in humanity and equality, especially women's equality, and wants to fight for all women to be seen and heard. It is my pleasure to welcome Zainab to say a few words.
I begin tonight by acknowledging the traditional custodian of the land on which we gather tonight and pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and extend my respect to Aboriginal and to Torres Islander people here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I stand before you to shed light on a topic that has been haunting the hearts and minds of many. The stark contrast between life before and after August 2021 for women in Afghanistan. The transformation within just a short period is nothing short of heart-wrenching. The lives of women and girls in Afghanistan have been turned upside down as they found themselves stripped of the basic rights and freedom that we often take for granted. Before August 2021, women in Afghanistan, although facing their challenges, were gradually making strides toward a more inclusive and equitable society. They were attending schools, universities, and engaging in various public activities. While their journey was not without hurdles, there was hope and progress on the horizon. It was when the world saw glimpses of change, a hope that the shackles of oppression were loosening and that the women could finally start to carve their paths. However, after the fateful August, a wave of darkness swept Afghanistan. Women and girls were pushed back in the shadows, their voices silenced, and their dreams shattered. The draconian measures enforced by the Taliban have left a chilling mark on the lives of Afghan women. They are not merely living, but existing in a world that has erased their presence from public space, extinguishing the flame of their potential. Can you imagine being told that education is a forbidden fruit, a privilege reserved only for some? The Taliban's imposition of a ban on girls attending secondary schools and higher education institutions is an assault on the foundation of progress and development. It insulted the aspiration and countless young women who dreamed of becoming engineers, doctors, and leaders. We cannot ignore that what is happening in Afghanistan goes beyond simple oppression. It is an egregious violation of human rights and vile form of gender apartheid. The systematic persecution of women based solely on gender is a crime against humanity and a stain on the world's consciousness. As we gather here, it has been 2 years since Afghanistan was handed over to the Taliban. While we stand on the outside, some of us have managed to adapt and find ways to cope with the pain, the fear, and the uncertainty. But our sisters in Afghanistan are trapped in a nightmare from which they cannot awaken. They are invisible, isolated, and suffocated, living in perpetual fear and captivity. We must not forget that brave women who stood up, dared to defy the norms, and chose to serve their country as police officers. These women put their lives on the line to ensure the safety and security of their communities. Yet, in the face of danger, they find themselves abandoned by the international community that once held them as champions of change. The financial incentives that were meant to encourage their participation have not been enough to shield them from the harsh realities of an insecure environment. The statistics reveal a grim reality. Women police officers in Afghanistan were making slow but steady progress, accounting for 2.6% of the police force. Their representation was the testament to the efforts made to pursue of gender-responsive policing reforms. However, as foreign influence recedes, the question lingers. Did the encounter with Western values truly impact the nation's mindset? Are the foreign ideals about the women's rights and equality being upheld? And are they fading away in the face of adversity? We must not acknowledge the excruciating stories that emerge from the shadows, the lives that have been lost, the future that have been stolen. Women like Negar Masumi, whose journey was brutally cut short, a life extinguished in a moment of unspeakable cruelty. Alia Azizi, a dedicated professional whose committed to justice led to her tragic and unexplained disappearance. The agonizing tale of Nuria and Menura, sisters who stood tall as pillars of security, only to be tragically taken away from us. It should be considered that the former Afghan policewomen are at particular risk of assassination, violence, or reprisal from violent extremists. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our responsibility to bear witness to the suffering of Afghan women. We must amplify their voices, share their stories, and demand justice. We cannot allow the world to ignore the atrocities being committed. Together, we must stand as a force of compassion and change, rallying behind the brave women who refuse to be silent. Let us remember that the fight for women's rights in Afghanistan is not just their battle. It is battle for the very essence of our shared humanity. It is fight for justice, dignity, and freedom. We must continue to raise our voices, advocate for change, and stand in solidarity with our sisters in Afghanistan until the day comes when their dreams are no longer stifled and their lives are no longer erased. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zainab. It's now my pleasure to invite Thamara Thomas to the front to say a few words about her remarkable Her Village Foundation initiative that she founded with Sohal Hashemi, who is not able to make it here this evening. Thamara?
Hello, my name is Thamara and I'm one of the co-founders for Her Village. Zahal couldn't join me today. Unfortunately, she's on a plane to Afghanistan with her family as we speak. I would really like to thank Zainab for sharing your story. I know it can't be easy, and I think that description of fighter and dreamer is just so correct. So thank you for that. And I'd also like to thank the Whitlam Institute, the UNSW Institute for Global Development, the Centre for Western Sydney, and Dr. George Varghese for the opportunity to speak today. So our story started in mid-2021 when the horrific images of Afghans escaping Kabul and grabbing onto planes played across our TV screens, as I'm sure that many of you would have seen. We decided that we wanted to do something and came together as a group. 3 members of our team are Afghan refugees themselves, having come to Australia a few decades back. It was really imperative for them to act. We wanted to raise funds and awareness, but most importantly, build a community of support for the young women who had fled their homes and everything they knew. So out of this came Her Village Foundation and the idea for the Village Championship, a 3-day program involving Afghan girls and students from Pymble Ladies College, aged 12 to 18, with the goal of building friendships and playing football. This journey started with us wanting to help out, but what we saw unfold in front of us was really a partnership. There was an equal exchange between the two groups of young women, and it was really mutually beneficial. We always open the championship with an icebreaker day where the girls get to know each other and participate in a leadership workshop. And the open-mindedness and courage that they approach a day with always moves me every year. Despite coming from two totally different worlds, both sets of girls come together to embrace an opportunity to learn from each other and their diametrically opposite lives and experiences. And I think this is the power of the youth. Our differences, though many, don't hinder us. It was one 15-year-old girl meeting another and talking about common topics like upcoming exams, Instagram, boys, their mutual love for soccer. The young Afghan people that I have been able to work with have taught me a lot through their resilience and courage. I don't want to minimise what they've gone through. They've seen war and tragedy at really close quarters, but they are truly the living testaments for the triumph of the human spirit. They are inspired and they are determined. They are absolutely ready to embrace life and opportunities that come to them with an open heart. They have high aspirations and they will achieve them. And this is also reflected in their parents. Their parents took a huge chance on us, who are practical strangers, and let their daughters be part of our program. The PLC girls who were involved with the program were also honoured to have a chance to meet and build friendships with their Afghan sisters. There is true power in female friendships, and I think something really special happens when women support women. For the teens of the North Shore bubble, this opportunity to meet people from a world completely different to theirs was invaluable and necessary. To be honest, I sometimes find it easier when I'm watching the news and I see these really horrible things to just switch off and disassociate, to think this is a completely different world, the numbers on a screen. But when you meet people and you talk to people who are going through these issues that you see on the news, it's a lot harder to ignore when you meet the people, the faces behind these stories. So for me, what started with this discomfort of watching innocent people suffer has turned into celebrations of warm and unlikely friendships and a really deep appreciation for the richness of Afghan culture through the moments that I've had over the past few years, through moments of dancing around in circles with my Afghan sisters and with Mother Mabuba, through moments of sharing palau and Barani Banjan, I think I've pronounced that wrong, and moments of being invited to break fast and join iftar dinners. I started this journey with the intention of giving, but I've ended up being a receiver. At Her Village, our vision is to create lifelong opportunities for girls who are recently arrived refugees in Australia. These are the leaders of tomorrow. They're not here to just survive, they're not here to just meet the minimum, but they're here to thrive. And I think we all have a responsibility to empower them in that journey. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of our speakers who've spoken thus far tonight. It's really a great honor that all of you have taken the time and applied your experience to sharing that with us and making this a really incredibly valuable experience. We now have a wonderful opportunity to hear from each of our speakers in turn. We will first hear from Shuja, Ahmad Shuja Jamal, to speak first, followed by Emeritus Professor Bill Maley, and then to round off the authors, Fred Smith will speak and also provide a performance for us. But before we go any further, I would like to invite Shuja to take to the stage. Thank you so much.
The difficulty with going first in a series of speakers who are co-authors is that you don't know where you're going to set the floor. So I hope you'll bear with me as I try to make sense of my speech here today. But it's a tremendous privilege to be here today amongst all of you, and I want to thank the Whitlam Institute and the UNSW Institute for Global Development, George, for your hard work in making today possible. Thank you all. And thank you also to everybody who is here today. You are choosing to spend your evening with us, and I'm very grateful for that. It's a privilege to share the stage today with His Excellency Ambassador Waissi, who continues to do the incredible work that he does with the embassy under circumstances that are far, far less than ideal. But also to share the stage with my co-author, Professor William Maley, with whom it's been a privilege to write this book, and of course with the remarkable Fred Smith. It's very nice to meet you at this event finally. But I also wanted to acknowledge the work and the speech that Zainab Khavari gave. As we write in the dedication of the book, very few people gave so much to Afghanistan and yet received so little in return, as did the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, in particular the female members of the forces. And I want to thank you for the work and the service that you've provided in Afghanistan and the work that you continue to do here. Thank you. But before I really start, I also wanted to acknowledge today everyone here from Afghanistan, whether you evacuated like I did, or whether you helped friends, colleagues, and loved ones evacuate, like I know many of you did, or whether you're working and waiting for the safety of family or friends, or also whether you're waiting for certainty in your own visa application and outcome and that of your family and friends here in Australia. I feel you and I hear you, and I'm glad that you're here with us and safe, at least at the moment. Exactly 2 years ago on this day and around this hour in Kabul, I was sitting in the VIP lounge of the Kabul International Airport. It was a full lounge and people were moving about, calling others and frantically texting, trying to find a flight to board and to leave Afghanistan. My phone was dying and I was trying to get the last few messages out, but after a few moments of twiddling and thumping my phone, I looked up and saw that the once busy lounge was now only nearly empty, with only one person, a woman, being there next to me. In that moment, it seemed like everyone else had managed to board flights and had gone out, or had at least managed to go somewhere safe. But here we were, the two of us, this woman and me, in our common moment of our vulnerability. But as darkness was falling on the city and the Taliban were advancing on the airport, I realized that this might be it. And I thought to myself, you have lived a good life and you have made all of the decisions about life, about work, about immigration in freedom, and it has come to this. And I thought to myself, I accept whatever comes next, to make peace with what was happening. But in those early tense hours, it was unclear what the nervous Taliban units entering the city would be doing to the people, to the population who worked, but also who worked in the government and were part of the National Defense and Security Forces, in a government that was now in flight. Would they go door to door and conduct a campaign of mass execution? Will they do what they did in Mazar in 1998, separating the Hazaras from the others and conduct summary executions? Will they do what they did in Shamali a year earlier, which was with their scorched earth tactics and use of rape as a weapon of war? Anything could have happened and nothing was beyond our anxious imaginations. But the Taliban proved more cunning this time than the last time, choosing to avoid the spectacle of violence, opting instead for what they did over the last 2 years, which is creeping persecution, lawfare as a tool of oppression via the use of edicts against women's public participation, but also holding the entire population hostage for a loaf of bread and a tin of cooking oil, and even then mooching off of the meager rations reaching the starving population to feed their voracious authoritarian appetites. We did not witness Mazar or Shamali this time, but we are witnessing something no less profound in its oppressive power. A population held hostage, a monopoly of terror, and a functional relationship with the world which was non-existent the last time. The banality of terror no longer bothers the global consciousness. So much so that some international organizations are calling for engagement with the Taliban. Certain neighboring countries are calling for diplomatic recognition, and world countries are engaging without shame in high-level diplomacy, unencumbered by the formalities of actual recognition. If the Taliban's oppression is keeping the government, the Afghan people from raising their heads, this kind of international legitimation is reassuring them that the oppression is fine as long as the violence is not made into a spectacle too inconvenient to ignore. This situation was not an inevitable consequence of the American talks with the Taliban that started in 2019. It was also not an inevitable consequence of the Taliban's second and dark, ominous coming into Afghanistan. The world could have done it differently. They could have done it differently. The idea of this book came at a very difficult time, and we wrote it at a very difficult time, personally for me and for the people of Afghanistan. But it was a privilege to do it. My first book with Bill, whose expertise and rigor are unmatched, and it has been a profound honor to work with you on this, Bill. And I think our hope for the book was to combine our relative strengths, Bill's formidable academic prowess, and my observations in the government over several years to create an analytical product and an academic treatment of the decline and fall of Republican Afghanistan as a first draft work of history. With the benefit of hindsight, our distance in time from 2001, and the availability of more information, we will see the events of August 2021 differently. That is inevitable. But in our book, we have attempted to treat differently the factors of decline from the factors of fall. The factors of decline went all the way back to the beginning of 2000. The Republican order, the post-2000 Republican order, and included matters of constitutional design, but also political order. And yet, critical as these factors were, they were not sufficient by themselves to cause the fall. In fact, many countries around the globe face similar challenges that Afghanistan did over the past 2 decades, and yet they remain in a state of decline for years, not quite falling like Afghanistan did. The factors of fall relate to events that were relatively more recent. Here, individual agency rather than simply structural factors are more prominent as critical causal factors. And the activities of different agents, of course, also come into play when the individual agency becomes more prominent as a causal factor. But we are today in a situation where the Taliban have frozen all avenues of interest articulation by the people of Afghanistan, political organization, a free media, civil society, political parties, the freedom of expression, a parliament, an accountable bureaucracy. None of these things exist in Afghanistan today. The constitution is discarded, and any legal protections against the whims of a zealous Taliban militiaman are completely non-existent. All violence is banned except the violence that the Taliban mete out on a starving population through their unaccountable machinery that is their militiamen. The impossibility of any form of political and civil resistance in Afghanistan is increasingly bringing to prominence the inevitability of resistance by other means, including by force of arms. And we are now in a situation in which the international community is not only failing to help push back against the tyranny of the Taliban, but it's also finding the courage to call on the people of Afghanistan to abstain from mounting legitimate ways of resistance to protect themselves. It is important to lay out the situation in such stark terms because it allows us to see the stakes for the people of Afghanistan who are bearing the brunt of the Taliban's oppression, but also the people of the world, if such oppression by a violently imposed regime is mainstreamed and legitimized. If the Taliban can get away with it, it will be a proof of concept for others. Letting them get away with it will make it that much more difficult to hold others to account all over the world. Weakened norms anywhere is a threat to norms everywhere. There is an obligation, in my view, at this moment for all of us to stand with the people of Afghanistan in their quest for a more just society, specifically in their right to choose their own future and the kind of government that they want. That right was taken away from them by force, and if Afghanistan is to have a future for its people, and be a responsible member of the international community, expecting that the Taliban would respect human rights or uphold those values in its international relations is a pipe dream, a far-fetched fancy. A country like Australia has an obligation to learn from the diplomatic mistakes that led to the return of the Taliban for two reasons. Number one, it is relevant to how the world should deal with the Taliban going forward at this moment. And number two, it is relevant to comparable situations that keep emerging all over the globe as we speak. But I think more immediately, Australia has an obligation to the Afghan people who are living the nightmare, an obligation to those who are waiting for humanitarian visas, and to those who, here in Australia, living amongst us in our own communities, are looking for safety, predictability about their future and the future of their families living abroad in fear and in danger. I would like to remind Australia of that obligation. There's more to be said, but I'll stop there and we'll hopefully continue the conversation in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shuja. I would like now to call upon our next speaker, Emeritus Professor Bill Maley. Bill served as Professor of Diplomacy at the ANU and was Foundation Director of the Asia-Pacific College of Diplomacy. He is currently Vice President of the Refugee Council of Australia. He has written extensively on and is one of Australia's leading scholarly experts on Afghanistan. Bill.
Thank you very much for your kind words. It's a pleasure to be here this evening to enjoy the hospitality of the University of Western Sydney and the support of the Institute of Global Development at the University of New South Wales, particularly under the leadership of my very old friend George Varugase, whom I first met in Kabul, where he was instrumental in the establishment of the Asia Foundation Survey of Opinion in Afghanistan, which has historically been a critical source of insight into the orientations of opinion in that country, and on which we've drawn very substantially for the analysis in various parts of our book. It's also a pleasure to be here under the gaze of Gough Whitlam, whom I actually knew in the 1970s when he was a visiting fellow at the ANU after his resignation as member for Werriwa in the House of Representatives in 1978. And the first of his seminars in that role, which I attended, was actually on human rights. And there is an interesting intersection there between that focus of Mr. Whitlam's and Shuja's work over a number of years in Human Rights Watch in the Kabul office, and indeed we first met more than a decade ago in Kabul at the Office of Human Rights Watch. I want to say just a little bit about some of the key themes in the book on which Shuja has touched already. I think the lessons of the book really come down to the importance of appreciating the complexity of events in Afghanistan. I think if I go to one more academic conference where somebody quotes from Kipling, who never once in his life set foot in Afghanistan, I'll probably go running screaming from the room. We would never try to make sense of 21st century Britain by looking at writings about Victorian England. And yet people do that about Afghanistan, despite the fact that in the 20 years from 2001 to 2021, no country in the world was more affected by globalisation than Afghanistan had been. This combined with the existence of a young generation, according to the most recent estimates before the collapse, 70% of the population being under the age of 30, which meant that globalisation potentially had a much broader effect in Afghanistan than one might have expected. And simply to give a couple of indications of that, the estimated number of mobile phones in Afghanistan by the end of the second decade of the 21st century was close to 15 million. And a majority of rural villages actually had access to television, according to the Asia Foundation's survey. And when one comes across those kind of data, one begins to appreciate that Afghanistan in the 21st century at this point in time is not the same country as it was even in the last decades of the 20th century, let alone earlier periods in its history. So understanding the complexity that flows from those kind of socio-cultural developments is very important. In unpacking this complexity, we look at 4 particular themes that contributed to the decline of the situation in Afghanistan. The first relates to institutional design and political legitimacy, and legitimacy in the sense in which we use the term refers to generalised normative support from the population, not necessarily to particular theories of moral legitimacy. And of course that's a very important asset for a regime or a government, because otherwise it may have resort to coercion or seek resources in order to build an exchange relationship with the population. Part of the problem for the Taliban is that, as Asia Foundation data make very clear, the Taliban lack popular support in Afghanistan. The 2019 survey, the last before COVID, showed that 85.1% of respondents had no sympathy whatsoever for the Taliban. That, I think, explains why coercion has been a prominent element of their survival strategy and why things are probably going to get worse before they get better in Afghanistan. We also look in detail at issues of aid dysfunctionality. Afghanistan was recklessly flooded with funds by international donors in the immediate aftermath of the overthrow of the Taliban, and no one should have been surprised that, given the limited absorptive capacity of the state at that time, all sorts of problems of corruption were to surface. Even the suspicion of corruption, when it has the effect of stripping ordinary people of a sense of dignity, is extremely damaging to the legitimacy of the state. There was a nice line that we quoted from an American political figure of the 19th century, John Randolph of Roanoke, who once said about one of his opponents, he is a man of magnificent abilities but utterly corrupt. Like rotten mackerel by moonlight, he shines and stinks. And there was quite a lot of that floating around in the political elite in Afghanistan, although there were some very impressive people as well. A third problem simply was that of insurgency. Afghanistan would probably be a very different country now had there not been sanctuaries provided to the Taliban in Pakistan from which they were able to mount attacks on assets of the Afghan government, which the Afghan government simply could not meet through cross-border attacks back into Pakistan. Western powers culpably failed to use diplomatic measures to address this particular problem, and instead made the mistake of framing Pakistan as part of the solution rather than as part of the problem. When you have 16,000 improvised explosive devices being detonated in a country in a single year, that suggests that it is not disgruntled peasants who are behind what's going wrong, but an organised military with a particular agenda of destabilisation, which in this particular case was focused on a need to prevent a pro-Indian government emerging in Afghanistan that the Pakistani military might find threatening, and thus things came to pass. And then, of course, there were problems of leadership under both President Karzai and President Ashraf Ghani. And one of the tragedies in these situations is that it's easy to hope that a leader will solve all the problems of a country, whereas most real-world politicians have some of the talents that one would like to find in a good leader, but not all. And certainly in President Karzai's case, part of his tragedy was that as time went by, his skills became less and less relevant to addressing Afghanistan's problems, and his weaknesses became more and more prominent in explaining his inability to make progress. And similar kinds of problems surfaced under President Ashraf Ghani, who was a very dynamic individual, but also a very explosive personality who made a lot of enemies. There's a story about Voltaire, probably apocryphal, that when he was dying, a priest came to him and said, "Now is the time to renounce the devil," to which Voltaire replied, "Now is not the time to be making new enemies." Unfortunately, President Ghani had no qualms about making new enemies and often saw it as a mark of achievement, really, and the chickens came home to roost a couple of years ago. Now, all these were factors of decline. And a lot of them were long-standing, and they reflected pressures on Afghanistan that had actually been imposed by its international supporters. The presidential system, for example, which had dysfunctional consequences, was very strongly supported by the United States. But if one looks to sheet home blame to the United States for errors, it relates much more to the agreement that the United States struck behind the back of the Afghan government on the 29th of February 2020, which became the critical contributor to the collapse 18 months later, in two respects. One was psychological, something which the United States seemed never to understand. Thomas Hobbes, in the 17th century, wrote that reputation of power is power. And in Afghanistan, that is probably the critical factor to understanding the dynamics of political relations. The agreement that the United States struck with the Taliban boosted the reputation of power of the Taliban and grossly undermined the reputation for the Afghan government. And ordinary people, even if they didn't like the Taliban, who nonetheless felt that it was not a good idea to be on the losing side in Afghan politics, looked around and drew the conclusion that the United States was selling out the government and it was time to switch sides. That then set the scene for a cascade that we witnessed where people repositioned themselves for prudential reasons. Some people have made, I think, the mistake of saying that what this reflected was a deep cultural orientation in Afghanistan, often blamed on the poor Pashtuns. I think that's a radical misreading of the situation in Afghanistan and very poorly grounded in evidence. The other effect of the agreement, which was really catastrophic, was to deprive the Afghan National Defence and Security Forces of operational capability, because they'd actually been designed and established to be interoperable with the forces of the United States. And the agreement that the US struck with the Taliban promised not only the withdrawal of the few remaining American troops, since most American troops had left by the end of 2014, but critically, that contractors whose expertise was essential to the ongoing functionality of the key capital assets of the Afghan Defence Forces. In that sense, the fall of Kabul was not so much a collapse of legitimacy as a collapse of military capability. If you let down the tyres on a Rolls-Royce, no matter what a fine vehicle it might be in principle, it's not going to carry you very far. And that, metaphorically, is exactly what the United States did for the sake of its own exit agreement with the Taliban. And that's why we conclude the book with an afterword which is called On Betrayal. It discusses philosophical ideas of betrayal and treachery. And it looks at different ways in which betrayal may manifest itself in international relations. And we look at three dimensions here. We look at the betrayal of allies. Afghanistan was, after all, in law, a major non-NATO ally of the United States. We look at the betrayal of the ordinary people of Afghanistan, who had repeatedly been promised by international actors that they would not be abandoned. And finally, we look at the betrayal of the declared values of the powers that walked away from Afghanistan. And there's simply no denying the fact that in their value systems, the Taliban were the antithesis of every single value to which the United States had committed itself over decades in projecting itself into the world. And here we are, I think, rightly critical of both President Trump and President Biden. This was a kind of equal opportunity betrayal. This is, frankly, one reason why in the current US administration there's very little desire to talk about Afghanistan. It's an embarrassment. But it's not one that's going to go away, because the problem with betraying an ally like this is that other people are watching. And 4 days after the collapse in Kabul, the National Security Advisor of Russia, Nikolai Patrushev, gave an interview in Izvestia in which he reflected on the situation. in Afghanistan. And the critical observation that he offered was that the White House would not even remember its friends in Kiev. So when the invasion of Ukraine took place, there was unusually abundant direct evidence that the abandonment of Afghanistan may have been a key contributing factor to the Russians' decision that it was actually quite safe to go into Ukraine because the United States had proven its unreliability as an ally. And two implications flow from that, and I'll conclude with these. One is that the Ukrainians should be very careful about the situation in which they find themselves, and the costs of the withdrawal from Afghanistan may, in the long run, prove to have been much greater for the United States and some of its allies than they were initially inclined to think. And of course, it's the people of Afghanistan who are now facing the full horrors of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's now my absolute honor and privilege and joy to invite our final author to speak to us this evening, Ian Fred Smith. Fred is an Australian diplomat. He has worked on peacekeeping missions in Afghanistan and the South Pacific. He was the first Australian diplomat to be posted in Uruzgan in Afghanistan in July of 2009, working alongside Australian soldiers in that province. Fred's second career as a musician came into the fore, his guitar serving as a bridge not only to the troops, but also to the people and tribal leaders of that war-torn region. Fred.
Could we switch over to my laptop? There we go. Well, thank you very much to all of you, George, for putting this together, and for the hosts, and Shuja, very good to meet you. Bill, I remember having lunch with Bill in May of 2021, and he said when things started to slide, there would be a cascade. Of course, Bill had been saying this for 12 years, and so I said, could you pass the chips? But he's right, and he was right. It was just a matter of time, I suppose. Anyway, I've been invited here to provide a bit of comedy to their class, and more than that, perhaps a kind of a different perspective, a personal, and I stress personal rather than official, perspective of an Australian diplomat who invested, in the end, quite a lot in the Afghanistan project. I joined the Foreign Affairs Department in 1996, working on the South Asia desk. And in August that year, of course, I found myself synthesising reporting on the collapse of Kabul when the Taliban swept in to the city in the back of Toyota Hiluxes. They say history never repeats, and it's true. This time, they were driving Ford Rangers. And of course, as they entered the city, you know what happened. People panicked, there were traffic jams. People climbed the fences at the airport. Some so desperate to get out, they clung to the tyres of rising planes and plummeted down on the tarmac. Like you, I watched this on television, except I was watching from a TV set in a hotel room in Doha. I was working at an interim Australian embassy to Afghanistan. And the scenes at the airport looked pretty messy, notwithstanding which 2 days later, I found myself on an airstrip at Al Minhad Air Base in the UAE, about to fly into Kabul International Airport as part of the advanced team of an Australian whole-of-government mission to evacuate visa and passport holders from the city. As we flew in that night, we expected there would be maybe a couple of hundred people lined up to catch the return flight to the UAE, but in fact there were only 26 that night, because the problem was that so many people had tried to get into the airport that there were these horrendous human log jams at the 3 functioning gates of the airport through which only the brave could pass. This advanced team was initially focused on the north gate And I went out there on the morning of the 19th of August, and I walked down a concrete security chute and out through a heavy steel door, and I saw in front of me a perimeter of razor wire extending from a blast wall on my left, most but not all the way, to a blast wall on my right, leaving a gap 3 metres wide, which was plugged by what I could only describe as a rugby scrum of US Marines, trying to prevent the mass ingress of the 2,000 or 3,000 Afghan people on the other side of the razor wire, pushing and shoving, trying to get in, waving visa documents. The people at the back were pushing forward, the people at the front were pushing back so as not to be driven into the razor wire perimeter. There was a constant cacophony of flashbang grenades, pistol shots, tear gas, and at one point I saw an old woman suspending an infant over the razor wire perimeter. I filmed what you just saw there on my little camera and the one in my right hand there. And I've got to say, I'd been reporting at that point for 12 years on Afghanistan. I'd read history, I knew bad things happen. But seeing it with my own eyes, I was very surprised by what I felt, and if I'm honest, what I felt was an anger that we'd let it go so badly. And I wondered, how did this come to pass? And you all know the history pretty well, of course. Following the attacks of 9/11, President Bush announced the invasion of Afghanistan, beginning with a bombing campaign and ground troops. Prime Minister Howard, of course, was in Washington, D.C. at the time. He invoked the ANZUS alliance, and we sent Australian Special Forces in to work alongside American and British Special Forces and the Northern Alliance militia to drive the Taliban out of Afghanistan into the mountains of western Pakistan, where, as Professor Maley explained, they enjoyed the protection and support of the Pakistan intelligence services. The following month, of course, talks were held in Bonn, Germany, that resulted in a democratic government, and for a while there things were looking pretty good in Afghanistan, so much so that the Australian government declared mission accomplished and brought our special forces home. The following year, a dilemma emerged as to whether the international US-led coalition should invade Iraq. Now, I've got to say, I thought this was a dumb idea at the time and was involved in protests against it on the lawns of Parliament House. I'm wearing that stupid green hat because I was trying to keep a low profile, hiding up there behind the microphone and the guitar. My dad was the Secretary of Defence at the time. It was awkward for me. Did they listen to me? No, they bloody went in. And we got embroiled in Iraq and took our eyes off the ball in Afghanistan where the Taliban began to resurge in the south and the east of the country. And so with the Americans up to their armpits in Iraq, NATO countries were called on to take on different provinces as part of a sensible enough international division of labour, and this created a dilemma for the Australian national security community, which was, should we join them? And further to objectives shared by both the Labour and the Liberal Party, notably adherence to the US alliance, it was decided we should, and the question became where. NATO said, go and help the Dutch in Uruzgan, and we did. Well, we said, where is Uruzgan? Sounds great. It's down in the south there. And so in 2005, we sent in Australian Special Forces. In 2006, we sent in engineers. In 2007, we sent in AusAid. In 2008, we sent in our infantry. And in 2009, the Australian government sent in Fred Smith. What could go wrong? And I worked there as what they called a political officer, engaging with Afghan provincial government officials, tribal leaders, trying to make sense of the complex politics, trying to support the provincial government through meetings, working always through interpreters, and that is how I really got to know and befriend the Afghan people and appreciate the fundamental generosity and sophistication of the culture through my relationships with these young interpreters. They were like young guys from anywhere, down from Kabul, trying to make a bit of money, looking to make a way in life. I tried to set a good example for them. You do what you can in these situations. I even tried to teach them a dance move that I learned from the former Australian Minister for Environment. The Foreign Affairs Department hasn't seen this footage yet. But I was working as part of the provincial reconstruction team. A different side, the military and kinetic side of the Australian operation has had a lot of publicity, for better and worse recently, but we were there doing a lot of development work. We built 200 kilometres of roads. We built 38 health centres. We built schools, including the Maley Girls' School, which eventually housed 700 girls up till 2020. It turns out most people in Uruzgan want to educate their girls. And we worked there through till 2013, when in accordance with the broader ISAF strategy, it was decided we should transfer responsibility for security onto the Afghan National Security Forces. And a ceremony was held, and Mr. Abbott and Mr. Shorten arrived, reflecting the bipartisan support for the Afghanistan mission. Mr. Abbott spoke, quite frankly, about what we'd achieved and what we hadn't. And then we civilians left, and eventually our soldiers left, handing over responsibility for security in the valleys of Uruzgan province to the Afghan National Security Forces. I came back to Australia and I had a handful of songs about Afghanistan. I found people in Australia wanted to know about it. I found myself touring a concert series called Dust of Uruzgan. Then I put out an album called Dust of Uruzgan. Then I wrote a book called Dust of Uruzgan. It was a dusty place. You can get both and make your dad really happy. But by 2020, the rigours of being a touring musician got too much for me. I was very stressed. I thought I'd take a bit of time off, relaxation, R&R. So I got a job working in Afghanistan. And I went back there in March 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic. Seems like a dumb thing to be doing in the middle of the pandemic, but that's what I did. And I worked as front of house for the Australian Humanitarian and Development Program in Afghanistan, including supporting the excellent work the Asia Foundation did. Working in the Kabul diplomatic scene, which of course was full of very intelligent World Bank officials, World Food Program officers, UN officials, military, diplomats, all working with the Afghan public service, trying to solve unsolvable problems using PowerPoint. At one point we got a contractor to divine the solutions to the problems of Afghanistan. They came up with this PowerPoint slide. It's a complex picture, but I suppose in the end what we were trying to do was support the Afghan state, which was something we really had to do after deposing the Taliban regime. And the state that we built had its problems, undoubtedly, but it did generate democratic representation for women. It did build an education department which increased the number of kids in school from 1 million in the Taliban years to 9.2 million by 2021, including 3.8 million girls. It did build a health system which increased life expectancy in Afghanistan from 44 to 61, and the Afghan National Security Forces numbering 300,000. And this created a platform of stability in the cities, if not the countryside. And on this platform, civil society began to develop in the cities. Women's activists, peace activists, journalists, aid workers, academics, medical people, artists, and of course public servants who we built a relationship with. And it was these civil society actors who I was interacting with when I went back to Kabul in 2020, who were becoming increasingly terrified as the winter of 2020-21 set in. It was a mild winter by Kabul standards, portending the drought that has since unfolded, but a very difficult one psychologically for the citizens of Kabul, for three reasons. Firstly, as Bill described, the Doha Agreement had undermined public confidence in the Afghan government and reputation of power is power. But more than that, the Doha Agreement had insisted that the Afghan government release 5,000 Taliban prisoners from the prisons of Kabul. And so it was that 5,000 Taliban came out of those prisons and went back to the provinces immediately to work on the battlefields of the provinces, or became active in the city of Kabul, where the Taliban was so happy with the deal they got from President Trump that they stopped trying to kill us internationals and instead embarked on a systematic campaign of targeted assassinations against Afghan civil society actors. They acquired these new sticky bombs from neighbouring countries, shall we say, and would plant them on the cars of civil society actors as they left for work in the morning. And the targets included female judicial officials, former electoral officials, former police, And of course, the kind of young men and women who worked at our embassies. I had 3 young guys working for me, urbane, educated, ambitious guys who enjoyed shaving. And they were in the target profile of the Taliban. They knew it, and they would leave home every morning at different times so as not to set patterns. They would get into one taxi, and they would get out of that taxi and get into another so as to not be followable. And they'd be grateful if they made it home alive when they did. I remember one morning I got a WhatsApp message from one of my staff members, Ahmad. He said, "Hi Fred, do you have time to see me today? I want to see you, it's a bit urgent." And I dropped around to his office. And he was looking very quiet, and we stepped out on the landing and had an exchange, after which he pulled a note out of his pocket, handwritten by the friendly neighbourhood Taliban, saying, "We know you work for the Australian Embassy. If you don't stop, we cannot be held responsible for the result." And this permeated the psychology of Kabul in the northern winter of 2020-21. Our staff were too frightened to attend weddings or funerals, family funerals, because one's mother might speak proudly of the fact that one's son worked at the embassy, and the word would get out and this would be dangerous. People were incredibly afraid and incredibly isolated. The second reason it was a difficult winter was that there was uncertainty as to what the Americans would do next. And of course, everything depended on what the Americans decided to do next. I think it's fair to say if President Trump had drafted the death sentence for the Afghan state, the question in December of 2020 and early 2021 was, would President Biden sign it? Now, Biden was on record as being sceptical about the Afghanistan intervention from the start. He was on record as saying that it had cost the United States $2.6 trillion. And he was on record as saying that he thought that 300,000 strong Afghan security forces would be enough to secure Afghanistan. But I suspect at the time he was overestimating the cohesion of the Afghan forces, absent an American force to support them. And he was also underestimating what it would cost to lose Afghanistan in terms of the United States' reputation for fidelity to allies, as described by Bill, not only in the eyes of those allies, but in the eyes of adversaries such as, for example, Vladimir Putin. The third reason it was a difficult winter was that the Afghan security forces, numerous though they were, had garrisoned in the cities, the population centres, leaving the roads around those cities exposed to Taliban checkpoints, and the Taliban were increasingly encroaching, rendering the Afghan forces dependent on US air, but also adding to a sense of claustrophobia, which I felt acutely that winter working in the bottom of the Chancellery in this little brown box, and for a bit of oxygen and headspace I would get up on the roof in the middle of the day. And I noticed by March that with the early springs the sparrows were flitting in the razor wire and the buds were popping on the trees, and I looked at those sparrows and I thought that for all the fear on the minds of the people of this city, the sparrows of Kabul don't give a shit. And I wrote this down in my notebook, meaning to turn into a poem, but I never got around to writing that poem until I got into hotel quarantine on return from the evacuation in September 2021 and hemorrhaged a poem I'd like to recite to you. Now, George and I decided that we wouldn't advertise that I was going to be doing poetry reading. We know how popular poetry readings are here in the Western Sydney. We would have had to hire the Combank Stadium just to accommodate the people. All last year we were living in fear of that which we thought soon might be. But the Sparrows of Kabul, those little brown birds, thought this was absurd and flitted around so free. For the Sparrows of Kabul would not be too troubled if the Taliban came into power. They'd eat their bread and shit on their heads, much as they'd done here on ours. But for the time being, they were pooing and peeing on helmets rather than turbans, except in the sticks, since the Taliban's tricks work better in rural than urban. For running a city takes electricity, which runs on American dollars. Emirate dreams and cold mountain streams won't wash office workers' white collars. For that you need cash, because the money from hash and exporting the sap of the poppy won't run power plants. For that you need grants from white folk in pants who drink coffee. who'd come a long way to earn expat pay in these soft office chairs where we'd sit sporting combat zone stubble. No, the Sparrows of Kabul back then did not give a shit. And then the great Donald Trump, so eager to dump the US commitment to cease in Afghan aloha, he sent Cal to Doha to strike an agreement for peace. Let's not pretend it was more a surrender with 5,000 Talibs released. Trump called Cal a hero, but he really got zero. The pact had more holes than Swiss cheese. And so the Taliban sat pretty as COVID hit the city and the hospital wards overflowed. They stopped killing internationals and targeted the fashionable parts of the town, don't you know? With strategic comms and new sticky bombs for targeted assassinations, the urban elite they killed on the street in order to white ant the nation. They killed noisy women and the odd moderate imam, mostly to prove they could. One of my reports said I nearly got caught in a bomb blast in his neighbourhood. Another got a letter saying that you'd better stop working for those infidels, or else who knows, the way the bomb blows your wife, your children as well. And then with everything riding on Joseph Biden in April deciding to quit, the Sparrows of Kabul knew this meant trouble, but back then did not give a shit. And that's why, I suppose, our embassy closed and they packed up my room and guitar, and with what looks like vision, we set up a mission, working on Zoom from Qatar. I watched them on TV and BBC in my room in that Doha hotel and called friends and brothers as one, then another provincial capital fell. I remember my grief when Senator Hanif called to tell of the fall of TK. I wrote in the cable how the governor was able to simply drive away. Like most army bases in disparate places, they made some attempt to defend it. But without US air, they could only despair, and in the end, they simply surrendered. On Facebook and Twitter, the veterans were bitter, lamenting the speed of the fall, but the Sparrows were blither. They seemed to be neither surprised, exercised, nor appalled. Had we looked hard, the whole house of cards was built on American air for strike and supply, and I guess that's why, when Biden said, "We're out of there," and pulled out the rug with grimace and shrug, first silence, then I heard a rumble. He paid the last tranche, then an avalanche. Each province, like dominoes, tumbled. To mix metaphors, we've seen this before. The Russians, and before them the Brits, said the Sparrows of Kabul, from empire to rubble. No, we really don't give a shit. There were memorable scenes on August 15 when the president fled for Dubai. The soldiers and cops took their uniforms off and headed on home to hide. There were good reasons why Ghani left for Dubai, but still it was a bitter pill. The Taliban lads had been expecting Leningrad, but sauntered into the void they must fill. To be greeted by strangers, they drove US Ford Rangers and MRAPs straight into the city, the palace they got, without firing a shot. And maybe that's not such a pity. They strutted and preened on August 15, most of them quietly thrilled they'd take young wives, then a month of long knives, when many we loved would be killed. And in the fun park, Talibs drove bumper cars like Poms at a beachside vacation, while the pundits discuss how the dog caught the bus, since they're faced now with running a nation that they tore apart. Still, they're making a start with checkpoints out on every street. And for a moment all is quiet, but there's bound to be riots when the people had nothing to eat. Because combined with the drought, the food will run out and Hunger Games soon will hit. Their bellies still full, the Sparrows of Kabul at this point did not give a shit. For those on the ground, the word gets around and the zero-sum game now commences. They leave home in haste. To the airport they race and manage to climb the fences. They give it a crack and rush the tarmac, thousands in deep desperation. On planes they all cramp without seeking a stamp from customs and immigration. Some cling to the tyres as the planes rise higher and plummet on down the city, and back home you and me watched on TV in anger, horror and pity. And then the Marines came down on the scene and laid down some threatening fire, and then went about clearing them out beyond the gates of Cairo. And so they gathered with mates beyond those gates to get back into Cairo. With children and wives, they risked their lives through sewage and razor wire, compelled to get through and start life anew as Aussie, Yankee or Brit, while the Sparrows of Kabul stay still on the double. I think they still don't give a shit. And now I'm hearing gunfire from the north gate of Cairo, and my nerves, it's taking its toll. It's a constant exchange like a two-way range, but its purpose is crowd control. The US Marines are working in teams to manage the menacing masses with rifles and spades and flashbang grenades and occasionally capsicum gases. Non-lethal means, but a messier scene I've not seen in my days of living. Mistakes will be made, prices paid, that's life. May they soon be forgiven. A few more get through this with cuts and bruises as between the Marines one more squeezes through cams and big boots, then out back through the chute where some, but not all, will get visas. Things kept getting worse until August 21st. That was the pivotal date. The North Gate stopped, so we shifted ops down south to the Abbey Gate. As I recollect it, the gate was protected by a huge long open sewer, and we asked our pals to cross that canal, and they did, because Afghans are doers. Into the mall they went, sandals and all, took grandmothers and kids across razor wire. I can't help but admire the people who did what they did. The sewerage was rancid. Some had their prayers answered. Others were turned away, while shoulder to shoulder, diplomats and soldiers worked 5 nights and 5 days. The boys in the ranks said, Jesus, it stank, and the fumes are making us sick, but we're not here much longer. We're packing our bongos. We'll be gone by the 26th. And so onwards the thrust until 26 August, the evening the bomber blew, killing 200, and I've since wondered who knew what and through who. For those little brown birds did not speak a word as the bomber put on his kit. The Sparrows of Kabul don't mind the rubble and generally don't give a shit. And after the splatter, the broken and battered returned to the gate once again to try and get through and do what they must do with children, loved ones and friends. And onwards they wade. Some stayed night and days, amazing displays of true grit until Biden called time. And the last plane climbed and the Sparrows did not give a shit. But those left on the ground went home with heads down as their hopes turned from ashes to cinder. And now it's worse than they feared. They're growing long beards and rugging up for a long winter. Back at Camp Baird, the shrinks asked how we fared as we dropped at the Q store our kits, our bellies were full. 3 hours from Kabul where the Sparrows still don't give a shit. And for us what came next was WhatsApps and texts from those left behind and their rallies. And apart from that, silence. And the low-level violence and the famine we now see on our tellies, and a few sleepless nights full of dreams of the sights and the sounds, the smell and the stress. Phone numbers and names, frustration and shame, feelings of helplessness. And so our war ends, home to family and friends, school pickups, lunchbox lids, drive around town, try to calm down, connect with our partners and kids over dinners we're eating here in central heating, in these comfortable homes where we fit. While the Sparrows of Kabul fly free over the rubble, I think they still don't give a shit. I suppose it was what it was. Now we're back in Oz. Through these COVID lockdowns we sit. While the Sparrows of Kabul fly free over the rubble, I think they still don't give a shit. Sweet daughter, now that I'm home, I'll do my best. Warm water through your hair I will comb. Let's buy that dress. I'm back from work overseas among Afghans. And if I should see Melodies, please understand. I seen the remnants of the Roman fleet, sifted embers of the February fires. I've read of Carthage and the fall of Crete. Nothing surprised me till the gates of Tyre. Your mama works a long day, comes home, it's dark. So let's put your Lego away and hit the park. Some nights we don't get along, but do not fear. Some nights My language is strong, but I'll be here. I've seen the remnants of the Roman fleet, sifted embers of the February fires. I've read of Carthage and the fall of Crete. Nothing surprised me till the gates of Cairo. Some nights I'm still getting calls saying, "Get me out of here." This happens when cities fall. Men trade in fear. I've seen children your age, my love, push through the mire. I've seen infants dangled above the razor wire. Some pushed and made their way through. This eased my mind. Some friends and people we knew were left behind. I'm grateful for a warm home. In here we're blessed, where I can sink like a stone in my helplessness. I've seen the remnants of the Roman fleet, sifted embers of the February fires. I read of Carthage and the fall of Crete. Nothing surprised me till the gates of Cairo.
Well, thank you, Fred. We now have the privilege again to hear from each of the authors as well. We are going to invite Zainab to take a seat in the front as well. We're going to have an opportunity now to ask questions of our authors and Zainab. And I'd like to introduce my former colleague, Leanne Smith, who's now the Chief Executive of the Australian Human Rights Commission, to run the Q&A session. Leanne is an international human rights lawyer and a former Australian diplomat who served with the United Nations in Afghanistan. So she's a very well appointed invigilator for our Q&A session tonight. So thank you very much, Leanne. May I invite the authors to take a seat in the front? Thank you.
I hope everybody's feeling okay in the audience. I can imagine that that some of that might have been quite challenging for people who are closer to these issues than mainstream Australian society, I suppose, in lots of ways. So I hope you're all doing okay. And I thought it might be worth saying everything that's been talked about so far and the conversation we'll have now is hugely complex, as Bill said earlier, and people have different opinions about what's happened and what should happen next, and it's really important that we respect each other's views in the conversation that we now have. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to speak with all of you, and I thought I might start the conversation off with just a quick question for each of you and then open up to the floor. I think we have about 20 minutes, maybe longer if we can push it. But I might start off, Ahmad, if I might, with you. When I was still with the Whitlam Institute 2 years ago, in the weeks before the fall of Kabul, we had a conversation about a range of topics that I think are still relevant 2 years later. We talked about what are Afghans across the country, especially minority groups, facing today. We talked about how the rights of women were likely to be affected or being affected. We talked about what Afghans would be seeking from the international community to support them, and how Australia could be part of that effort. So we've talked a lot about what has happened, and I wanted to shift the focus a little bit now to where we go from here, because I think that's a challenge and a frustration for a lot of people. 2 years ago, when you and I spoke, you spoke about the resistance to the Taliban, and you talked about acts of reclamation. And I saw this week in a piece in the New Yorker with Ambassador Russell in London. He was being asked about what the solution is, and he said, war is not the solution. We need to start with an intra-Afghan dialogue. I wanted to ask you, you must be grasping for what comes next as well. Is that the way forward, and what would that look like from your perspective?
Thank you, Leanne. I think the ambassador is absolutely correct that war is not the way forward, and that there has to be some form of a political coming together of the people of Afghanistan in a way that is free, and that is free from the pall that the Taliban cast on any kind of dialogue that might emerge inside of the country as controlled by the Taliban. The one formula that has been sort of upheld as a potential path forward is really to sort of put back on track the Doha deal, which included sort of a negotiation between the then Taliban and the then government. And I think there are still elements of the former government, elements of some diplomatic actors who still want that to be sort of brought back as an agenda item and as a way forward. I think the more it is a difficult situation, because the more you talk about not resisting, not resorting to violence, you are saying something that is absolutely correct. But at the same time, you're also taking away the only way that people in Afghanistan actually might resist what is happening in Afghanistan at the moment, because all other peaceful avenues of interest articulation, of resistance, are gone. That's not advocacy for violence. That is us trying to understand the stark reality that we're faced with, but also in us sitting outside, I think, is important to not deny avenues that people inside might actually choose to follow. Difficult as that may be for a lot of them, and uncertain the outcomes of that as it may be. So that is to say that there is, I think, the inevitable, the only way is to solve it through dialogue in a political process. But as we get there, I think the world has an obligation to stand with the people of Afghanistan in their aspiration for a more just society, in their aspiration to actually live free from fear, in their aspiration for the girls and for the women to have public participation. And I think what I am deeply disappointed about is the complete and utter failure of the world to actually take a stand in support of these values that really amounts to anything. And I think that is my big disappointment. And that's part of the reason why you're in certain segments, you're beginning to see the futility of the diplomatic engagement. And I think there's nothing more fatal to a future based on political dialogue than this hopelessness about stemming from, I think, this lackluster diplomatic engagement in support of those values.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Bill, I might put the next question to you, which flows on from what Ahmed said, and it's probably the toughest question I can think of right now. there's a strong debate going on about layers of recognition of the Taliban as a legitimate government in Afghanistan, and there are strong views around this, with the Afghan people suffering so terribly in so many ways, and the impact of sanctions and refusal to recognise. Can you share with us, in your mind, what we are weighing when we talk about that decision for individual nation states or for the international community as a whole?
Sure. Taking off my hat as somebody who works on Afghanistan and putting on my old hat as a professor of diplomacy, really, there are several observations which immediately come to mind. First is that recognition is a complex idea rather than a simple one. It can encompass recognition of states, which has been internationally the case for Afghanistan for decades. Afghanistan joined the League of Nations in 1934, which showed it was recognised as a state. There can be recognition of governments. Not all states, however, go down that path, and Australia, since 1987, has had an official policy of recognising states only and not getting involved in the weeds of whether to recognise a particular group as a government or not. There's then the question of whether the recognition of which one is speaking is de jure recognition under international law, a kind of formal recognition, or a de facto recognition in which you treat a government to all intents and purposes, or claimant to governmental power, as if it's the government. Now, the Taliban, it was argued before the collapse, could be incentivised to behave in accordance with international norms because they desired recognition. And there was a paper to this effect published by the United States Institute for Peace, but it became very clear very quickly that they didn't actually desire recognition to the point where they were prepared to moderate their behaviour in any serious respect or share power with anyone. And in fact, the Taliban have never shared power with anyone. They are a totalitarian movement in that sense, even though sometimes they've gulled people by talking about a disposition to share power. There seems to be in some circles, this surfaced when the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations went to Princeton University this year and began burbling in front of an open microphone, which is never a good idea if there's someone in that situation. The notion that the UN could orchestrate a process whereby it would offer recognition to the Taliban in the long run in exchange for the Taliban meeting certain benchmarks. The problem with that is that it is not something the UN can offer because recognition is a sovereign capability of states. It's for individual states to determine whether they will recognise a state or a government and how they will go about it. And a terribly obvious point, which has been overlooked time and time again in this context, is that states have their own domestic politics. And there is absolutely nothing in it for any of the key states in the world who are being supplicated to contemplate recognition to do it when the risk of a domestic outcry is so strong. And we recently saw a manifestation of this when a British MP, Tobias Ellwood, went to Afghanistan with the Halo Trust, most unwisely put out a video about what a wonderful trip he'd had. It was like Peter Sellers' Balham Gateway to the South in some ways. And there was a storm of protest to the point that there is now a motion of no confidence before the Defence Committee of the House of Commons for discussion on the 8th of September to remove him from the position as chair of the committee. And if one looks at a government such as the Australian government, it's inconceivable that the Australian government would risk the backlash that it would get from the Afghan community, from women's groups, from the opposition, if it were to go down a path that looked anything like a recognition of the Taliban. So we're talking about what technically in diplomacy is called a two-level game, where diplomatic actors are not only engaging internationally with other counterparts, but they're also trying to manage a domestic political environment. So in that sense, I think the notion of of recognition of the Taliban as pretty dead at the moment and unlikely to revive. What we may see are attempts to explore pragmatic engagement through the representative offices that are located in Doha, which offer the principal channel through which Western governments are talking to the Taliban at the moment on issues relating to the granting of visas for people who might be keen to leave Afghanistan and come to some Western country. But I think essentially because of the domestic politics of key states, it's really not on the agenda that we're going to see movement in that respect. Of course, even if you open an embassy in Kabul, the key locus of decision is now in Kandahar. Not in Kabul. And if there's a lesson that flows from the process of engagement that culminated in the Doha Agreement of the 29th of February 2020, it's that it never pays to kid yourself about the authority of the people with whom you're dealing. One of the key questions in diplomacy is whether the people with whom you're engaging are actually binding the movement that they purport to represent. And it's now excruciatingly clear that the United States and its representatives were completely conned in Doha. That they swallowed whole a propaganda line which was being presented to them by the Taliban, which bore no resemblance to what the Taliban actually intended to do. And I should wind up, but in the book we go into a great deal of detail about the technical defects of the Doha Agreement. And essentially the Americans began their negotiation by saying nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, which is a perfectly legitimate approach to negotiation. It means that any concessions have to be matched reciprocally by credible concessions on the other side. They then switched to a two-stage process where they said, first we'll have our agreement with the Taliban, and that can open the door to intra-Afghan negotiations. But because the Taliban got from the Americans everything that they really wanted, 5,000 prisoners, a timetable for withdrawal and a place at the main table, they actually had no incentive whatever to negotiate seriously with the Afghan government, and they didn't. Blind Freddy could have told them that that was how things were going to play out. And sometimes I think that although the United States is the most powerful country in the world economically and militarily, in terms of the quality of the policy process, it's somewhere between the government of Queensland and the government of the Northern Territory.
Yes. And thereby undermining 20 years of work because leaving the Afghan government and the state and the institutions out of any possible future. Yeah. I might turn now, Zainab, to you. I'm so glad you could join us on the podium. I think any conversation like this about the future of what's happening in Afghanistan can't be had without a woman at the table, and you have such valuable experience, and you spoke to it so beautifully earlier. I thought it would be great for the audience to get a sense of what it's like to be a female police officer in the ANP and what having women in the ANP contributes to society.
First of all, thank you from the Whitlam Institute to invite me. And I'm in a panel with the great authors. It's a great honor for me. I joined the police in 2007. The time I studied in a Kabul Police Academy, I was the only female in my classroom. That time, actually, the society and Afghanistan wasn't ready for a woman to join the police. The community, they never view policing as a respectful job for women. The inside, the outside, the police, even though inside the police wasn't secure for women. But due to in support of international community and the encouragement of women to joining the police, in that time, totally 5 students was in a Kabul Police Academy that we were studying policing as in a professional way for 3 years. Presence of women in a police is a killer. It is an issue in everywhere. Even though in Australia, I read about 30% of the woman force, police force are women, and even though in the US is 30%. That time was can say zero. There wasn't like a professional police in a police force of Afghanistan. But I heard in around 2021, 2.6% of the police force was women. In a country such as Afghanistan, there were law, constitution, and Afghan constitution and laws protects the women's rights, but never consistently enforced. And the presence of women was very effective, but unfortunately, how we can expect the women's right in Taliban's presence? Because when the Taliban take power, they ban a school for women and girls, and now we can expect they have the women have equal right.
Thank you, Zainab. Thank you for that perspective. And my last question for you, Fred. I know that you're not here in a DFAT capacity, so I thought I would ask you a more personal question, given that you shared so much with us tonight. I personally would be really interested to hear what things you learnt the most in your time in Afghanistan from the Afghans you met and befriended. What's your impression of the people and the culture?
Oh, look, I just appreciated, firstly, the deep tradition of courtesy in Afghanistan. Trying to get through a doorway with an Afghan friend can take up to a week after. But the grace with which they live in an extremely precious situation. Secondly, their sense of humour in the face of great difficulty, and thirdly, their determination to move forward in life and look after their kids and make lives for themselves. And we're seeing that amongst the diaspora here, including my former staff and interpreters. So it's heartening to see them prospering here and safe and happy, and their kids going to school and doing swimming lessons.
Absolutely. Thank you. We have a little bit of time, John, for some questions from the floor, and I know how much expertise is sitting out there right now, so we really appreciate hearing from you. I see a hand up, please.
Thank you very much.
Maybe we'll wait for a microphone for you.
Thank you. Thank you. Khalil Nasri is my name, Vice Chair of Ariana Australian Association. We've been around for quite a while. Bill and I go a long way. Thank you very much, panel. I really enjoyed that. I know enjoy is probably not the right word, but is very informative, and thank you very much, and thank you, Mrs. Khavari, for your input as well. Just a couple of comments, if I may, and then I'll ask a rhetorical question, and Fred, Bill, and Mr. Shuja might decide to answer or not. Afghanistan is a land of minorities, so we don't have a majority. Secondly, from our community perspective, people have become realists, so they see the Taliban as a project, geopolitical game, and unfortunately, the people of Afghanistan, especially women, are collateral damage. So whenever the West achieves their strategic purpose, I'm sure there will be a change. Secondly, in terms of, you may want to answer this or you may not, the dichotomy, quite hypocritical at that, in terms of the approach to the resistance of the Ukrainians to the Russians, where we have the entire NATO and the West cheering on the Ukrainians, yes, fight for your freedom, and yet where we have resistance to the terrorist regime, which the biggest democracy in the world, legitimized. In the valley of Panjshir, Andhra, Badakhshan, we had operations in Kabul only last week. We had operations in Badakhshan last week, where people are fed up. So they've taken arms. They have no other choice, as Mr. Shuja pointed out. Why is there this approach that, no, put down your weapons and don't resist? Yeah? Why is there that approach? If I may add, there is this growing momentum in terms of the Taliban lobby that apparently just opening the doors to girls' schools will solve all the problems. And the Taliban have become very cunning, so they may open the doors. What's next? Thank you.
Thank you. Who'd like to respond? Yeah.
Just a very quick comment. I think the last point you've raised is a very pertinent one, because the issue about schooling is not just who gets to the school, but what's in the curriculum. And the Taliban have been reworking the curriculum for schools in Afghanistan. There have been a number of reports that have come out which have looked at this in a way which would actually lead the activities of the schools, in inverted commas, to be so far from the understandings of school education in countries like Australia that there's a real question about whether it would the cure would be worse than the disease. In some ways, you know, if you end up creating madrasas that are designed to crank out people who will potentially be very radical in the future, it's not a good thing for anyone. And frankly, I think people have forgotten the lesson of the genesis of the Taliban movement, who really were orphans who came out of madrasas in Pakistan into which they'd been taken as children, who got very pure doses of ideology. And the naive notion that if you get people who are trained up through this kind of process emerging in 10 or 12 years' time, they're going to be a controllable force, is pretty dangerous, really, that groups like that have a habit of spinning out of the control of the people who created them. And that, you know, there's the old saying, you sow the wind and you reap the whirlwind. And that's something that's worrying me quite a lot at the moment.
Since we're talking about education, I might invite Mabuba Rawahi, who's with us in the audience, the founder of Mabuba's Promise, to maybe focus, Mabuba Jan, on the work you're doing with schooling in Kabul and around the country.
Thank you, Leanne. What should I say? It's, Fred, it's, I remember I met you about 15 years ago in Canberra and asked you to do one concert for Afghanistan children, but it didn't happen. It will in the future. But this is the best PowerPoint I ever seen, and you talked while the pages is going. That was really professionally done. But you know what? You just talk about, with your poem, the pain that every Afghan go through on that particular time. I remember that the day that the regime change and Taliban get into that country, it's a deep sorrow and pain, as if the whole Afghanistan die. And I remember that we work on my house for 4 or 5 people trying to evacuate my orphan children from Afghanistan, working 7 days, every minute, every night. And I know I send the children to that gate, all these 200 tiny children from the orphanage, to go from this gate to that gate and walk through the water. So you bring that so much pain that people been through with your PowerPoint, and that's amazing, but very, very, very painful, very, very painful. That show you really deep down involved with what people been through. I am also so proud of Jamal, John, and Zainab. It's give me hope that with my old soul and rundown old lady, now we have the younger generation of Afghan who is going to be our future. I am so proud of you, Jamal Jan, for your book and for your talent, mashallah, you're a beautiful person, and I'm so proud of you, Zainab Jan, for being representative of Afghan women. We did it for 40 years tirelessly and trying to focus on education for women and for young girls. I built a school in top of mountain. I built orphanages. I worked tirelessly over 40 years, day and night, dedicating myself for well-being of women and children in Afghanistan. And I believe that Afghanistan needs our second generation to dedicate themselves like us. But it's, yes, you ask about the education. I had a school in province Panjshir Valley and another school in Paghman, quite a lot of provinces, but there used to be 300 girls, now it's 50 girls. And it's so sad that Afghan girls, they're not allowed to go to school. But there is hope. Afghan people is so strong, they don't give up. So in every houses in Afghanistan, there's under the ground, which is called basement. And now there's a lot of education going for women. I myself organize tailoring course for them and bring them to learn something with their hand and activity for learning. So it's such an amazing night, and it's painful but also hopeful for us. Lots of love. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahbub. I see a hand at the back.
Thank you very much for the very informative presentation. My name is Javed Nadir. I'm a student at UNSW. There is an Afghan saying called "Az bad badarish toba." May God save us from the worst of the worst. And some of those worst, I think Ahmad Shuja mentioned the worst, like what happened in Shamali and in Mazar. May I invite you to, Ahmad Shuja and Bill, to talk about some of the worst that may happen in Afghanistan, especially given the power dynamics within the Taliban and also that dangerous mixture of ideology in young men. What could happen and how that could be prevented, especially by the international community? Thank you.
Go ahead, Bill.
Okay. Thanks, Javed. Afghanistan has a very distressing history from April 1978 onwards in terms of mass atrocity crimes. And one of the things that we've learned in the past is that mass atrocity crime that goes unnoted by the wider world is at risk of being repeated in other areas within a country in which it's occurred. One of the worst mass atrocity crimes in recent times was the massacre of 2,000 ethnic Hazaras by the Taliban in Mazar-e-Sharif in August 1998, which was documented by Rupert Colville of UNHCR, who went on to be the spokesman in Geneva of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. But that was just one of many different cases that could have been identified. And what it reflects is the dangers that flow from an ideological position that says that the end justifies the means. And totalitarian ideologies tend to be associated with a disposition to mass atrocity crime because of this very kind of notion that the end justifies the means, and it is there. If you ally that with the problem that I was highlighting, that the Taliban, in order to maintain their position, are not in a position to rely on generalised normative support or an exchange relationship, then coercion is the default mechanism for regime maintenance. That doesn't just apply to Afghanistan, it's a much broader point. Now, in some circumstances, we saw this with the Great Terror in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. The scale of repression that accompanies a particular episode of cracking down is so great that people remember it for decades. And it almost obviates the need to engage in daily repression because the memory of what the state's capable of doing is so raw and so recent in people's minds. Now, I remember when I was in Moscow in 1992, talking to an old lady who said that for decades after the Great Purges, she and her family kept a packed suitcase in the house in case the secret police came to take them away. For decades. Now, the Taliban would hope to be able to do something like that, but several sociological factors can militate against that. One is the globalised character of the young generation. Another is the extraordinary activism of women in Afghanistan who have lost so much and who continue to take to the streets. A third is the problem of reverse cascades. When the Taliban took over in 2021, it was because a lot of people had realigned from February 2020 onwards. But those people, even if now they are flagged as members of the Taliban, don't necessarily love the Taliban. The moment the Taliban start looking weak, the danger is that those people will peel away and that you will get a much more dangerous situation on the ground for the Taliban themselves. Now, I'm not predicting that at a particular time, but it is a vulnerability there, which in turn militates in favour of the Taliban trying to maintain as powerful a reputation as a repressive force as they can. Because one of the ways in which you prevent people engaging in a prudential shift of that sort is to create the impression that it is still incredibly dangerous to attempt to do so. And this is, in a sense, how the Nazi regime survived until the end of April 1945. It was crumbling, but there was still potentially a terrible fate for anybody who stood up and opposed Hitler directly. There was enough of a coercive capability there. And this is one reason, of course, why it's really important for international players engaging in Afghanistan to make sure that they do nothing that is facilitating the maintenance by the Taliban of a coercive capability. Because if they do that, it's simply fueling the incentive for the Taliban, if they've got that capacity, to use it, to try to send a signal that it's very dangerous to oppose them. But just as the collapse of the Taliban surprised a lot of people, but not me, it would not surprise me if in the event that the Taliban begin to unravel, they unravel pretty quickly.
Did you, you want to...
Thank you, Bill. I think to follow up on what you talked about, a globalized Afghan population, in particular an Afghan youth population, I think it's important to put that in context because this population actually, a lot of it since 2001, the late 2001, if you were a teenager, now you're in your 40s. If you were in your 20s, now you're in your 50s. But if you were born in 2001, 2, 3, 4, you're now in university. So for a lot of these people, for multiple generations over the past 2 decades, their relationship with the government, their relationship with the state is actually a relationship of a citizen and a state with all of the mutual rights and responsibilities and obligations that come with that. And I think we are at risk of multiple generations coming after this who are born under the Taliban, go to Taliban schools, graduate from Taliban universities, and go to work in Taliban regime. And to them, that relationship with the government is a relationship of a subject and an emir, a ruler who is not bound by a constitution, does not broach any disobedience or any criticism. My fear is that there will be a point in which our taking for granted of the Afghan people's ability to maintain their aspirations there will be a point in the future that taking for granted without supporting and nurturing those aspirations that exist right now, I think will have catastrophic multiple generation effects in which people will come under the Taliban, go to Taliban schools and become Taliban public officials and become subjects as opposed to citizens in a country that's not governed by a constitution or any elected officials, corrupt as they may be. And so they become that. And I think there's a real risk of us taking that for granted, which might eventuate that. This is relatively less relevant, but I have always been deathly afraid of what is happening in Pakistan, because you have lived in Pakistan, I have lived in Pakistan. There is a wholesale radicalization of the population. And obviously that doesn't mean that there aren't pockets that are that think the other way. But I think those pockets are increasingly squeezed and silenced and unable to articulate their ideology. And I think there's a risk that actually could happen on a scale in Afghanistan that could turn back the progress we've had in mindsets. Because creating schools and universities, creating institutions where people could serve is one thing, but it also creates an aspiration in the public, where a girl born in 2002 could aspire to be in parliament or in the cabinet, but a girl born in 2022 under the Taliban will have a dramatically different aspiration, because the mental horizons are just quite different. And that, I think, I'm really very much afraid of.
It's terrifying. I think we have time for one more question, and I saw a hand go up earlier. Could we bring a microphone up to the fourth row, please?
Thank you for holding this meeting. It is very useful. This meeting shows the world hasn't forgotten Afghanistan. I am Dr. Zia Golrezai, member of leadership of High Council National Reconciliation of Afghanistan. Because my English is not well, I speak in Persian. I'm on daughter. I will translate for. اول ما تشکر میکنم از این جلساتی که شما امروز گرفتین و همه ما رو به یاد افغانستان انداختین. ما یک سال تمام با طرف مذاکره طالبان بودیم و هیئت مذاکره زیر نظر شورای مصالحه ملی بود و تمام مواردی که طالبان در نظر داشتن ما اطلاع داریم که چه گذشت و چه اتفاقی افتاد و در نهایت افغانستان سقوط کرد. این روز سیاه برای مردم افغانستان است.
I'm translating on behalf of my mother. She says that we were holding and leading the peace negotiation during 1 year.
این جلسات بسیار مفید است، اما مهمتر ای است که ما چه راهکاری را برای حل مشکل افغانستان مخصوصا زنان افغانستان پیدا کنیم.
These kind of meetings are so valuable for us and reminds us of Afghanistan and the sorrow and the pain that we've been through. But the most important thing is that to find a solution for this problem, especially for the women of the Afghanistan.
متاسفانه همه دنیا وضعیت افغانستان را خبر داره و ظلمی که علیه مردم افغانستان و به خصوص زنان افغانستان میشه. زنان افغانستان امروز از تمام حقوق انسانی خود و قانونی خود محروم هستند. اما متاسفانه هیچ صدای قوی برای حمایت از زنان و مردم افغانستان در دنیا بلند نمیشه.
It is very painful that the sorrow of the Afghanistan has been clear for the whole world, But the point is that women in Afghanistan doesn't have any human rights and they can't be heard. So
دنیا چه کاری باید انجام بده برای زنای فراموش شده افغانستان؟
But our question is that what world can do for the forgotten women of the Afghanistan who live in Afghanistan but they don't have any voice to talk and to defend themselves.
فکر کنم که لازم باشه همه ما دنبال راه حل بگردیم برای مشکل افغانستان.
I think that it is necessary for all of us to find a solution for this huge problem.
و من امیدوار هستم که یک از نتیجه‌های مهم این جلسه ای باشه که ما یک راه را برای مردم افغانستان به خصوص زنای افغانستان پیدا کنیم.
And I'm really hopeful that we can find a solution for this problem, especially for the women of the Afghanistan, in this kind of meetings.
Thank you so much.
Who would like to take on any suggestions about the way forward? I think we'd all like to leave tonight with a little bit of optimism about what we can engage in, how we can support, what we can do. Anybody on the panel, on the stage, like to offer some thoughts of hope for how we can keep fighting for the people of Afghanistan and especially the women of Afghanistan?
Can I take that on? Thank you. I think I'm old enough to remember that in 2009, when President Obama decided to start negotiations with the Taliban, they talked about protecting human rights and protecting the constitution of Afghanistan, not as outcomes of any negotiations, but as preconditions to entering negotiations, right? And then when President Trump came to power, he did away with the notions of human rights even as an outcome of negotiations, did away the notion of the constitution in Afghanistan as an outcome of negotiations. He said all of that stuff is for the Afghans to figure out, and if they want a constitution, they will. If they want human rights, they will. So basically, there was a point, I think, in lowering the aspirations of the international community from a political settlement inside of Afghanistan. And I think we are at this moment in a place in which the world is actually also faced with, I think, a paucity of ambition with respect to Afghanistan when it comes to human rights and when it comes to values. I'm astounded that we don't speak as forcefully as we did, that we don't bring up as passionately as we did issues of human rights, issues of women's rights, issues of a constitution, issues of, I think that the phrase was to stop a backsliding of rights in Afghanistan, right? That was a phrase up until August of 2021, and we're not using or hearing that anymore. And I think the fundamental first step in actually making sure that we make progress in the direction of the safeguarding of these rights is to actually talk about them, and to talk about them in a way that we value them, and in a way that we value them for the people and the women of Afghanistan. And I think I talked about how disappointed I am about the diplomatic measures or efforts that have failed the people of Afghanistan on this account. And I think our job fundamentally is to keep the discourse about those values and about those rights alive and with the same ambition that the people of Afghanistan deserve. Because that is the first step that I think will galvanize any political effort or any diplomatic effort in the direction of a settlement. Because without those, you go from a constitution and human rights being preconditions to our constitution and human rights being an outcome to them being nothing. So the way you set your aspirations, I think, is important. It's fundamental, and I hope that we can actually get the international community to go back some part of the way in that direction.
Can I add something? Please. As before I said, I am asking anyone having voice to be the voice of the voiceless women in Afghanistan, as they, like, we can fight for and advocate for them. They can't do anything now. Many of the women that I was working with them, my colleagues in a police, they are pushed to go to home. They are isolated, and I believe many of them there were the breadwinner for their families. They had responsibilities, and they are in a risk of poverty. And I have a concern for them, for their families, for their children, and for this reason, I asking anyone to having voice, to having power, to raise their voice and fight for the women's right in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Just two very quick quotations, really, which I think offer both concern but also some hope. Nietzsche once said that the state is the coldest of cold monsters. And I think that's a fair observation, and it's not a good idea to leave to the state the responsibility for pursuing issues of this sort. Having said that, I remember an Australian politician who was known to Gough Whitlam, namely Sir Robert Menzies, once said, never pay any attention to anonymous letters unless you get a few thousand on the same subject. And that's a wise observation too. If there is evidence that the wider society is actually animated about an issue, then even the most cynical politicians from time to time will be disposed to sit up and listen. And I think that is an opportunity for us to make sure that politicians who might simply want Afghanistan to go away have to sit up and listen, and then also listen to those amongst their fellows, their peers, who may be much more sympathetic to the cause and who see that what is happening to people in Afghanistan is not, as it were, their natural fate, but simply a consequence of unlucky people having to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when the sky fell in. That can happen to anyone. Yeah. And it's the responsibility of all of us to do what we can about that.
Thank you, Bill. Fred, you get the last word again.
Well, look, I think for all, a lot was achieved over the last 20 years in Afghanistan, and a lot of that has been lost since. But what hasn't been lost is that now we switched the lights on. Back in the 1990s and the Taliban years, people could not see out of Afghanistan or into Afghanistan. But now through the internet, people can see out of Afghanistan, and people here can see into Afghanistan. And so I think there is a real role for you, the women of the diaspora, in supporting the women of Afghanistan for as long as it takes. And I congratulate you for the work you're doing.
I think that I'll pass back to John now, but thank you very much for answering my questions.
Thank you very much, Leanne, and again, thank you very much to each and every one of the panelists. It's now my final honor of the evening to welcome the Ambassador Waissi to the front to offer a few concluding remarks. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. As we wrap up today, I'd like to extend my heartfelt congratulations and also gratitude to our colleagues and friends from University of New South Wales, University of Western Sydney University, the Whitlam Institute, the Institute for Global Development, and also for Centre for Western Sydney. And special thanks goes to George Verghese, that in the spark of some discussions, we ended up to this magnificent event. Thank you very much. Your concerted efforts and partnership have orchestrated this timely and enlightening event. As we poignantly mark the somber second anniversary of Taliban's forced takeover of Afghanistan. Taliban actually announced today a national holiday, and they are celebrating the withdrawal and kick out of the United States from Afghanistan. This occasion allows us to not just remember the event of the past, but also contemplate the future collectively. The book by Shuja, Jamal and William Maley, The Decline and Fall of Republic in Afghanistan, is not just a meticulous investigation of a nation's downfall, but it also stands as a testimonial to the depth of human endeavor and, at times, its vulnerabilities. Through its detailed analysis, we are reminded of the many forces at play, from international power dynamics, the significant roles played by neighboring countries, to the internal strife within Afghanistan. Most importantly, this book sends out a clarion call, urging us to understand that the Afghan Republic did not merely fade away. It was, in many senses, betrayed. It is said, while history provides us the facts, art provides us the feelings. And this sentiment couldn't be more resonant than in the Sparrows of Kabul. Fred Smith, through his music, has not only provided a chronicle of Australia's involvement in Afghanistan, but has also brought to life the raw emotions, challenges, and complexities faced by those on the ground. These finely observed snapshots, whether they are tales of dust-filled days in Orazgan or the heart-wrenching final moments of the Kabul evacuation, reveal an Afghanistan that many of us have never seen or never felt. They remind us the human cost, the sacrifices made, and the lives changed forever. I would also like to acknowledge the expertise of Leanne Smith, the Chief Executive of the Australian Human Rights Commission. Her esteemed presence not only amplified the importance of our discourse, but also ensured that our conversation is both grounded in respect and directed towards a deeper understanding. This year, the world commemorates the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a landmark achievement in human history. However, we are confronted with starkly contrasting realities in Afghanistan. Picture this. A violent extremist group seizing a strategically located United Nations member stands in stark opposition by entirely discarding the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and nearly all major international treaties and conventions. Our discussions this evening emphasize the critical needs to grasp the context and complexities within these contrasting global narratives. And it just held in the perfect location, the Whitlam Institute. The Whitlam Institute has always been at the forefront of fostering conversations that drive societal understanding and change. Today, as we remember Afghanistan, it is essential to embrace the complexity of international responses, recognizing the intricate interplay between security, development, and humanitarian engagement. In these challenging times, I urge all of you to use these stories and insights as catalysts. Let them guide our actions, shape our conversations, and inspire a brighter, more informed future. And as we reflect upon our role and the choices before us, let us remember the profound words of Prime Minister Gog Whitlam, as once he said, "The decision we will make for our country on 2nd December is a choice between the past and the future, between the habits and fears of the past and the demands and opportunities of the future. There are moments in history when the whole fate and future of nation can be decided by a single decision. For Australia, this is such a time. Taking inspiration from Whitlam's insight, we recognize that our understanding and response to the events in Afghanistan are also a testament to our choices. As we deliberate on the past and future of Afghanistan, we must ask ourselves, will we be trapped by the habits and fears of yesterday? Or will we embrace the opportunities to foster a brighter, more understanding tomorrow? The weight of this moment in history demands our decisive, united, regardless of race, language, religion, and compassionate action. Ladies and gentlemen, our continuous quest for understanding, we owe a deep debt of gratitude to both Shuja Jamal and Professor William Maley. Please, round of applause. Their insightful work shines a light on this dark chapter in history, presenting us with clarity and fresh perspective. Equally, our appreciation flows deeply for Fred Smith, whose words and melodies have masterfully painted a touching tapestry of Afghanistan's human experience. Furthermore, I would like to extend our profound thanks to our speakers, Zainab Khavari and Tamara Thomas, who have, of course, yes, you have only one choice, who have graced this event with their insights, enriching our discussions and deepening our understanding. And to you, to all of you, our attentive audience, I have so many great faces, great personality here. I see Mahbub Rawi here. I see Ziaul Rezai. I just thank you very much for bringing up those points. I see Saim Hushman here. He just evacuated. He is our first environmentalist in Afghanistan, graduated from the School of Environment. God knows what's happening. They just cut all trees yesterday in Oruzgan province, because that is at least the fight that they can do with people and with their livelihood. We have Bilal Sangi we had here, and we have so many other good friends. Javed Nader is here, Susan Schmidl. They have worked, they put all energy and efforts together. We have Joseph Cesar. He just put a book about an interpreter and his life and his difficult times from Afghanistan to Australia. So your presence and engagement amplify the significance of today's event. Your willingness to engage, to learn, and to emphasize is a testament to the importance of these conversations. I was truly honored to make these remarks with all of you, with very esteemed individuals, and together with you. Thank you very much, and very good evening.
Just before everyone breaks up for the evening, I want to thank everyone for attending on behalf of all the institutional partners. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for your final words. Thank you to each of our authors, and as well as Tamara and Zainab for your additional remarks tonight. They are heartfelt, and in all of this misery and despair, talk of betrayal and abandonment, I thank you each for your generosity of spirit, and thank you for your insights, and I thank you for sharing your personal stories and experiences with us. It has been a privilege to launch both of these books. They are both available for sale at the back room where refreshments are awaiting. And as our nation goes towards a period of referendum to consider us giving a voice to our First Nations people in the Constitution, there's a Yolnu term that's been talked about, makarata, which refers to a process of coming through struggle to find agreement and peace. And I wish that for Afghanistan. Have a good night.